The DJ kept playing, even as my entire stepfamily walked out during my father-daughter dance. 23 guests pulled out their phones to record what happened next, and the footage they captured changed everything about how I saw my life. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Elena Jones, and I thought I understood what family meant until my wedding day in Portland, Oregon proved me completely wrong. When my dad Marcus remarried 5 years ago, I was 21 and honestly relieved. He'd been lonely since Mom passed when I was 16, and Sandra seemed to make him genuinely happy. She came as a package deal with her 3 kids from her previous marriage, twin boys Jake and Connor, who were 19 at the time, and their younger sister Melissa, who was 17. Sandra worked as a hospital administrator, always impeccably dressed and organized. She had this way of making lists for everything and color-coding schedules that initially impressed me. The twins were both studying engineering at Portland State, and Melissa was captain of her high school debate team. On paper, we looked like the perfect blended family. The first red flag came during holiday planning that first year. Sandra suggested we start new traditions, since we were now a new family unit. What this actually meant was abandoning every Christmas tradition Mom and I had shared with Dad and replacing them with Sandra's family customs. The ornaments Mom had collected over the years were quietly moved to the basement. Our traditional Christmas morning pancakes became Sandra's elaborate brunch spread. Even the way we opened presents changed to match what Sandra's kids were used to. Dad seemed oblivious to these subtle shifts, just happy that everyone was getting along on the surface. Whenever I brought up missing our old traditions, he'd pat my shoulder and say, "Change is good, Elena. Your mother would want us to be happy." The twins treated me like I was invisible most of the time. They'd make plans for family activities and forget to include me, then act surprised when I felt left out. "Oh, we figured you were busy with your own things," Connor would say, with this innocent expression that never reached his eyes. Jake was worse. He'd actually smirk when Sandra would criticize something I did. Melissa was different. She seemed almost aggressive in her dislike of me, constantly making little comments about how things were before Dad married your dad. She'd correct me if I referred to Marcus as my dad in front of her friends, saying, "Actually, he's my stepdad now." It was petty, but it stung every single time. The real issue started when I got engaged to my college boyfriend, David, 2 years ago. David Chen was everything I could have asked for: kind, funny, successful in his marketing career, and he genuinely loved spending time with my dad. He'd come over for Sunday dinners and help Marcus with projects around the house, and they'd developed this easy friendship that meant the world to me. When we announced our engagement, the contrast in reactions was startling. Dad was thrilled, immediately pulling David into bear hugs and talking about welcoming him to the family. Sandra smiled and said all the right words, but there was something cold in her eyes. The twins offered brief congratulations before immediately changing the subject. Melissa actually rolled her eyes and muttered something about princess weddings under her breath. Wedding planning became a minefield. Sandra volunteered to help, which I initially appreciated, but her version of help involved constantly suggesting ways to cut costs and scale back our plans. When I showed her the venue David and I had chosen, a beautiful garden space at the historic McMenamins Kennedy School, she pursed her lips and said, "That seems quite expensive for one day." The twins were supposed to be ushers, and Melissa was meant to be a bridesmaid. Getting them to participate in any wedding-related activities was like pulling teeth. They'd show up late to dress fittings, forget about scheduled appointments, and generally act like my wedding was a massive inconvenience to their lives. The worst part was how Dad seemed completely unaware of the undercurrent of resentment. He was so excited about the wedding, talking about how proud he was and how much he loved David. He'd bought a new suit specifically for walking me down the aisle and kept practicing his father of the bride speech in the mirror when he thought no one was looking. 3 weeks before the wedding, Sandra dropped the first major bombshell. She announced that the twins had been invited to their cousin's graduation party in Seattle the same weekend as my wedding. "It's such a conflict," she said with fake sympathy. "Family obligations are so complicated." I stared at her, waiting for her to say they'd obviously declined the graduation party, but she just looked at me expectantly. Well, I finally said, I hope they can figure out their priorities. That seems a bit harsh, Elena, Dad interjected. It's their cousin's graduation. That's important too. The twins ended up deciding to attend the graduation party. They'd be driving up to Seattle Saturday morning and wouldn't be back until Sunday evening. My wedding was Saturday at 4 p.m. The second bombshell came a week later. Melissa announced she'd been selected for a last-minute academic competition that same weekend. It's such an honor, Sandra gushed. These kinds of opportunities don't come along often. I'm sure Elena understands how important this is for Melissa's future. I felt like I was in some kind of alternate reality where everyone had collectively decided my wedding wasn't worth prioritizing. When I tried to talk to Dad about how hurt I was, he gave me this tired look and said, Elena, you're being a bit selfish. These are good things happening for your step-siblings. Can't you be happy for them? That's when it hit me. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being Dad's priority. His new family's needs and wants had somehow become more important than mine, and he didn't even seem to realize that it happened. The final straw came 2 days before the wedding. Sandra informed me that she'd developed a severe migraine condition and wasn't sure she'd be feeling well enough to attend the ceremony. She might need to rest at home, she explained, and of course, Dad should stay with her if she was feeling poorly. But it's Elena's wedding, Dad said, looking confused. And I'll be devastated if I ruin it by being sick, Sandra replied, pressing her hand to her forehead dramatically. You know how my migraines can be, Marcus. Sometimes the best thing I can do for everyone is just stay home and rest. I watched this exchange feeling completely numb. David found me crying in our bedroom that night and held me while I sobbed about how my own stepfamily was systematically destroying what should have been the happiest day of my life. We could postpone, he said quietly, wait until things settle down. But I was done waiting for things to settle down. I was done accommodating people who clearly had no interest in being part of my life in any meaningful way. No, I told him, we're getting married on Saturday, and whoever shows up, shows up. Dad tried to convince Sandra to come right up until Saturday morning. I could hear them talking in their bedroom, his voice pleading, and hers remaining firm about her condition. The twins had already left for Seattle Friday night, and Melissa had departed for her academic competition. As I was getting ready Saturday morning, applying my makeup with shaking hands, Dad knocked on my door. When I opened it, he was standing there in his new suit, looking older than I'd ever seen him. Sandra's not feeling well enough, he said quietly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. But I'm here, he added, his eyes filling with tears. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I don't know how things got so complicated. That was the closest he'd ever come to acknowledging what had been happening, and it meant everything to me in that moment. The ceremony itself was beautiful despite everything. David's family filled their entire side of the venue, and my friends and remaining relatives created a warm, loving atmosphere. Dad walked me down the aisle with such pride and joy that I almost forgot about the empty seats where my stepfamily should have been sitting. It wasn't until the reception that the real drama began. We'd planned for a traditional father-daughter dance to The Way You Look Tonight, the same song Dad had danced with Mom to at their wedding. David and I had our first dance, and then the DJ announced it was time for the father-daughter dance. Dad took my hand with this huge smile, and we moved to the center of the dance floor. That's when Sandra walked in. She appeared in the doorway of the reception hall looking perfectly healthy, flanked by all 3 of her children. No signs of any migraine, no indication that she'd been too sick to attend her stepdaughter's wedding. She was even dressed up, wearing a navy blue dress I'd never seen before. Dad and I were about 30 seconds into our dance when he spotted them. I felt his body go rigid, and he missed a step. I followed his gaze and saw them standing there, and the expression on Sandra's face made my blood run cold. She looked furious. Dad stopped dancing completely. His hands dropped from their position, and he just stood there staring at his wife and stepchildren. The music continued playing, but we were frozen in the middle of the dance floor, like deer caught in headlights. "Marcus," Sandra called out, her voice cutting through the gentle melody, "we need to talk." The entire reception fell silent. Our guests turned to look at the family drama unfolding, and I could see phones being pulled out of purses and pockets. David started moving toward us from the head table, but I caught his eye and shook my head slightly. Something told me this needed to play out exactly as it was happening. "Not now, Sandra," Dad said, his voice barely audible. "This is Elena's moment." "Actually, this is exactly when we need to talk," Sandra replied, stepping further into the reception hall. The twins flanked her like bodyguards, and Melissa wore an expression of pure smugness that made my stomach churn. Jake spoke up first. "We know what you've been saying about us, Elena." I blinked, genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," Connor added. "Melissa heard you on the phone with your friend Rachel last week, talking about how we're not really family, how we're just people Dad got stuck with." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. My mind raced, trying to remember any phone conversation with Rachel. Then it hit me. I had been venting to my best friend about feeling excluded and unwanted. I'd said something like, "Sometimes I feel like Dad got a ready-made family, and I became the extra person he got stuck with." They twisted my words completely. "That's not what I said," I protested, but Sandra held up her hand. "We've tried so hard to include you, Elena, to make you feel welcome in our family, but it's clear you've never accepted us." Her voice took on this wounded, martyred tone that I'd heard her use with Dad before. "We thought it was best to give you the space you obviously wanted for your special day." The manipulation was breathtaking. In front of our entire wedding reception, she was rewriting 5 years of history, painting herself and her children as the victims of my rejection rather than the architects of my exclusion. "That's not what I said," I protested, but Sandra held up her hand. "We've tried so hard to include you, Elena, to make you feel welcome in our family, but it's clear you've never accepted us." Her voice took on this wounded, martyred tone that I'd heard her use with Dad before. "We thought it was best to give you the space you obviously wanted for your special day." The manipulation was breathtaking. In front of our entire wedding reception, she was rewriting 5 years of history, painting herself and her children as the victims of my rejection rather than the architects of my exclusion. "That's completely untrue," I said, finding my voice. "You've made it clear from day one that I wasn't really part of this family." "That's enough," Dad said, but he wasn't looking at Sandra. He was looking at me. "Elena, lower your voice. People are staring." I felt like he'd slapped me. Here was my stepfamily crashing my wedding reception to stage some kind of public confrontation, and his concern was that I might embarrass them by defending myself too loudly. "People are staring because your wife and her children decided to show up at my wedding reception to start a fight," I said, my voice getting stronger, after claiming she was too sick to attend the ceremony. Melissa laughed, actually laughed. "We never said we weren't coming to the reception. We just knew the ceremony would be boring." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. This 17-year-old girl had just dismissed the most important moment of my life as boring in front of everyone I cared about. Sandra placed a protective hand on Melissa's shoulder. "What Melissa means is that we wanted to respect your wishes for an intimate ceremony, but we certainly weren't going to miss celebrating with you." "By showing up during my father-daughter dance to start drama?" I asked incredulously. "We're not starting drama," Jake said. "We're trying to address the elephant in the room. You've made it obvious you don't want us here." I looked around at our guests, all of whom were watching this unfold with varying degrees of shock and discomfort. David's parents looked mortified. My college friends were recording with their phones, probably thinking this was some kind of reality show. My elderly Aunt Margaret, one of the few remaining links to my mother's side of the family, had tears in her eyes. "You're right," I said suddenly. "I don't want you here." The words came out before I could stop them, but once they were out, I realized they were completely true. I was tired of pretending, tired of trying to force relationships with people who had never wanted me in their lives to begin with. Sandra's eyes widened in what looked like triumph. "See, Marcus, this is exactly what we've been dealing with." But Dad was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was something closer to recognition, like he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. "Elena," he said quietly, "what are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm done pretending this is a happy blended family," I said, my voice steady despite the tears starting to flow. "I'm done walking on eggshells around people who have spent 5 years making it clear that I'm not welcome. I'm done watching you choose their comfort over my feelings at every single turn." "That's not fair," Dad protested. "I've tried to keep everyone happy." "No, Dad, you've tried to keep them happy. There's a difference." Sandra stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "How dare you speak to your father that way, after everything we've done for you?" "What exactly have you done for me?" I asked, turning to face her directly. "You've systematically erased every trace of my mother from our house. You've excluded me from family activities. You've made me feel like a guest in my own father's life. And now you've shown up at my wedding to make it about yourselves." "We came to support you," Connor said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You came to cause a scene," I replied, "just like you've been causing scenes for 5 years whenever I tried to maintain any kind of relationship with my father." The DJ, bless him, had kept the music playing softly through this entire confrontation. It created this surreal backdrop, like we were performing some twisted version of a dance routine where everyone had forgotten their steps. David finally made his way over, placing a protective hand on my lower back. "Maybe we should take this conversation somewhere more private," he suggested diplomatically. "No," Sandra said firmly. "This needs to be said. Elena has been poisoning Marcus against us for years, and it's time everyone knew the truth." "The truth?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The truth is that you married my father and decided I was an inconvenient reminder of his first life. The truth is that you've spent 5 years pushing me out so gradually that he didn't even notice it happening." "That's ridiculous," Jake said. "Dad treats you like a princess." "Dad treats me like a guest. He's embarrassed to have overstayed her welcome," I corrected. "And you've all encouraged that dynamic because it benefits you." Melissa stepped forward, her teenage cruelty fully unleashed. "Maybe if you weren't so needy and dramatic, people would want to be around you more." The words hit like a physical blow. This child, who I'd tried so hard to connect with over the years, had just reduced all my pain to being needy and dramatic. The same child who threw tantrums when Sandra didn't buy her the right brand of jeans, who demanded Dad drive her places when Sandra was perfectly capable, who had never once shown me basic courtesy in 5 years. I looked at Dad, waiting for him to defend me, to tell his stepdaughter that speaking to me that way was unacceptable. But he just stood there, looking overwhelmed and lost. That's when I realized that this moment, this public humiliation at my own wedding reception, was actually a gift. It was showing everyone, including Dad, exactly who these people were when they thought they could get away with it. "You know what?" I said, my voice carrying clearly across the reception hall. "You're absolutely right, Melissa. I have been needy and dramatic. I've been desperately trying to earn love and acceptance from people who were never going to give it to me, but I'm done with that now." I turned to Dad, who was looking at me with a growing alarm. "Dad, I love you. I will always love you. But I'm done competing with your new family for scraps of your attention. I'm done pretending that people who actively dislike me are somehow my family. And I'm especially done having my wedding day turned into another opportunity for them to put me in my place." Sandra's mouth fell open. She clearly hadn't expected me to stop defending myself and start speaking plainly about the situation. So here's what's going to happen, I continued, feeling stronger with every word. You four are going to leave my reception right now. My husband and I are going to continue celebrating our marriage with people who actually love us. And tomorrow, we're going to start our new life together without the constant drama and manipulation that has defined the last 5 years of mine. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the DJ seemed to sense the gravity of the moment and let the music fade out completely. Dad looked like I'd physically struck him. Elena, you don't mean that. I absolutely mean that, I said, tears streaming down my face, but my voice unwavering. I'm choosing myself for the first time in 5 years, and it feels incredible. What happened next was something I'll never forget as long as I live. The entire reception hall remained completely silent for what felt like an eternity, with over 100 people watching this family implosion unfold in real time. Sandra was the first to break. Her carefully constructed facade of wounded innocence cracked completely, and her true nature came pouring out like poison from a broken bottle. "You ungrateful little brat," she hissed, stepping closer to me. "After everything Marcus has given you, after all the opportunities we've provided, this is how you repay us?" David immediately stepped between us, his protective instincts kicking in. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back from my wife." "Don't you dare tell me what to do," Sandra snapped at him. "This is between families." "No," David said firmly. "This is between you and the exit. You need to leave now." That's when Jake made his fatal mistake. He shoved David hard, sending him stumbling backward into a nearby table. The sound of glasses crashing to the floor seemed to snap everyone out of their shocked paralysis. David's brother Michael, who had been watching from the sidelines, immediately stepped forward. Michael was 6'4" and built like a linebacker from his college football days. "Touch my brother again and see what happens," he said in a voice that could freeze hell over. But it was my friend Rachel who really took charge of the situation. She'd been recording everything on her phone from the moment Sandra walked in, and now she stepped into the center of the chaos like a general taking command of a battlefield. "Security," she called out, even though the venue didn't have security. But her authoritative tone was so convincing that 2 of David's male cousins immediately flanked her. "These people are disrupting a private event and need to be escorted out immediately." Sandra looked around wildly, suddenly realizing that the room had turned against her. What she'd planned as a public humiliation of me had backfired spectacularly. Instead of making me look like the problem, she'd revealed her own toxic behavior to everyone who mattered to me. "Marcus," she said, desperately, turning to my father, "are you going to let them throw your wife out of your daughter's wedding?" And that's when Dad did something that shocked everyone in the room, including me. He looked at Sandra with an expression of complete disgust and said, "You're not my wife right now. Right now, you're just someone who crashed my daughter's wedding to start a fight." Sandra's face went white. "How can you say that to me?" "How can you do this to Elena?" he shot back. "On her wedding day, in front of everyone she cares about?" It was like watching someone wake up from a 5-year coma. Dad was finally seeing the situation clearly, and he didn't like what he was looking at. Connor tried to salvage the situation. "Dad, we were just trying to clear the air. Elena's been saying things about us, and we—" "I don't care what you thought," Dad interrupted, his voice louder than I'd ever heard it. "This is my daughter's wedding reception. You don't show up here to clear the air about anything. You show up to celebrate, or you don't show up at all." Melissa, who had been silent since her cruel comment earlier, suddenly burst into tears. But they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of fury at not getting her way. "This is so unfair," she wailed. "We're your family too. Why does Elena get to be mean to us and nobody cares?" The manipulation attempt was so blatant, so obviously calculated, that it actually made several of our guests laugh out loud. Here was a 17-year-old trying to paint herself as the victim after crashing someone's wedding to call them needy and dramatic. Dad looked at Melissa with something approaching pity. "Sweetheart, Elena hasn't been mean to you. She's been trying to be part of this family for 5 years, while you've all made it clear she wasn't welcome. And I was too caught up in trying to keep everyone happy to see what was really happening." Sandra's mask slipped completely. "So that's it? You're choosing her over us? Over your own wife and children?" "You're not my children," Dad said quietly, and the words dropped into the room like stones into still water. "I tried to be a good stepfather to you, but you've never once tried to be good step-siblings to Elena. And you," he turned to Sandra, "you've manipulated me into choosing between my daughter and keeping peace in the house for 5 years. I'm done choosing anyone over Elena." The twins exchanged glances, clearly realizing that their carefully orchestrated plan was falling apart. Jake made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "This is crazy," he said, looking around at our guests as if appealing for support. "We're the ones being attacked here. We came to celebrate, and Elena started screaming at us." That's when something beautiful happened. My Aunt Margaret, all 4'11" of her, stood up from her table and walked over to Jake with her cane clicking on the floor. She looked up at this 6-foot-tall 24-year-old and said in her sweetest grandmother voice, "Young man, I've been watching this family for 5 years, and you are a liar." The simplicity and directness of it was devastating. Here was an 80-year-old woman calling out a grown man's dishonesty with no fancy words or complicated explanations. Just, "You are a liar." Jake's face turned bright red. "You don't know what you're talking about, old lady." The second those words left his mouth, the room erupted. David's father stood up, followed by his brother, followed by half the men at the reception. Even some of the women looked ready to throw hands. You don't disrespect an elderly woman at a wedding. It's just not done. "That's enough," David said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You 4 need to leave right now, before this gets any uglier." Sandra looked around the room one more time, searching for any ally, any sympathetic face. But everyone was staring at her with expressions ranging from disgust to pity. Her grand gesture had backfired completely. "Fine," she said, drawing herself up to her full height. "Come on, kids, let's go home where we're actually wanted." But none of her children moved toward the door. Instead, they all looked at Dad, waiting to see if he would come with them. The moment stretched out uncomfortably as everyone realized they were witnessing the final breakdown of a blended family. Dad looked at Sandra, then at her 3 children, then at me. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear. "Elena, I owe you the biggest apology of my life. I let them make you feel unwelcome in your own father's house, and I'm sorry. I was so afraid of causing conflict that I forgot my first responsibility was to you." He turned back to Sandra. "I'll be home later to pack some things. We need to have a very long conversation about what happens next." Sandra's composure finally cracked completely. "You're leaving me? For her?" "I'm not leaving you for anyone," Dad said. "I'm leaving you because of who you've shown yourself to be tonight, because of who you've been for 5 years, and I was too blind to see it." The twins and Melissa suddenly seemed to realize that their secure home situation was crumbling around them. Connor stepped forward, his earlier bravado gone. "Dad, wait, maybe we can work this out." "By showing up at Elena's wedding to publicly humiliate her?" Dad asked. "By calling her needy and dramatic? By pushing her husband? There's no working this out, Connor. You all made your choice when you decided to do this tonight." Sandra gathered what remained of her dignity and headed for the door, her children trailing behind her like confused ducklings. But she couldn't resist one final parting shot. "You'll regret this, Marcus," she called over her shoulder. "When you're sitting alone in some apartment, you'll remember that Elena will have her own life and her own family, and you'll have nothing." Dad looked at her with genuine sadness. Sandra, I've been sitting alone for 5 years, even when I was in the same room with all of you. At least now, I'll be honest about it. And then they were gone, leaving behind nothing but scattered flower petals on the floor and the lingering scent of Sandra's perfume. The entire confrontation had lasted maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like it had changed the fundamental structure of reality. The DJ, who had been standing frozen at his booth through the entire ordeal, suddenly came to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I think it's time we got this party back on track. Elena and Marcus, would you like to finish your dance?" I looked at Dad, who had tears streaming down his face. He held out his hand to me, and I took it. As the opening notes of "The Way You Look Tonight" filled the reception hall again, we moved back to the center of the dance floor. But this time, when we danced, it felt completely different. It felt like I was dancing with my father, really my father, for the first time in 5 years. The rest of our wedding reception transformed into something magical that I never could have anticipated. After Dad and I finished our dance, really finished it this time, something shifted in the entire atmosphere of the celebration. It was as if a dark cloud had been lifted, and suddenly everyone could breathe again. Our guests rallied around us in the most incredible way. David's cousin Tommy, who worked as a professional photographer, had captured the entire confrontation on video. He quietly approached us during dinner and said, "I got everything. If you ever need proof of what really happened here tonight, you have it." But it was Rachel who truly amazed me. She had organized a group text with several of our friends during the chaos, and they had been discreetly documenting everything. Not for social media or gossip, but because they recognized that what had just happened was a watershed moment that might need to be remembered clearly later. "Girl," she said, pulling me aside during the cake cutting, "I've been your friend for 8 years, and I have never been more proud of you than I was tonight. You finally told the truth, and it was beautiful." The stories that came out afterward painted a picture I hadn't fully understood while living through it. David's mother mentioned that she'd noticed how uncomfortable Sandra always seemed whenever Dad talked about me during family gatherings. She would literally change the subject every time Marcus brought up something you'd accomplished, she told me. I thought it was odd, but I didn't want to say anything. My college roommate Lisa admitted she'd been biting her tongue for years about Sandra's behavior. "Remember your graduation party 3 years ago? Sandra spent the entire time talking about the twins' grades and Melissa's debate victories. When someone asked about your promotion at work, she just said, 'Oh yes, that's nice,' and immediately started talking about Connor's internship." These revelations kept coming throughout the evening. Apparently, Sandra's dismissive attitude toward me hadn't been as subtle as I'd thought. It had been obvious to almost everyone except Dad and me. Dad, because he didn't want to see it, and me because I'd been too close to the situation to recognize the patterns. But the most surprising conversation happened around midnight, when most of the older guests had gone home and only our closest friends remained. Dad approached David and me at the head table, still in his wedding suit, but looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. "Just the three of us?" We moved to a quiet corner of the reception hall, away from the remaining dancing and celebration. Dad sat down heavily in one of the chairs and rubbed his face with both hands. "I need to tell you both something that I've never admitted to anyone, including myself," he began. "I knew Sandra resented you, Alina. I knew it from the very beginning, and I chose to ignore it because I was terrified of being alone again. The honesty of it hit me like a physical blow. Dad—" "No, let me finish," he said, holding up his hand. "When your mother died, I thought I was going to die too. The loneliness was so complete, so overwhelming, that when Sandra came along and made me feel wanted again, I would have done anything to keep that feeling, including sacrificing my relationship with my own daughter." David reached over and squeezed my hand as Dad continued. "Sandra never asked me to choose between you and her. She was too smart for that. Instead, she made it clear that any attention I gave you, any priority I showed you, any tradition I maintained with you, made her feel insecure and unwelcome. So gradually, bit by bit, I started putting her comfort ahead of your feelings. He looked directly at me with tears in his eyes. I told myself I was keeping the peace. I told myself you were strong enough to handle it, that you understood I was trying to make everyone happy. But the truth is, I was a coward. I was so afraid of losing another wife that I let myself lose my daughter instead. The weight of his words settled over us like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just an apology, it was a complete admission of guilt and responsibility for 5 years of emotional abandonment. Tonight, watching Sandra attack you at your own wedding, seeing her children disrespect you and David, I finally saw what I'd been enabling all this time, Dad continued. I saw the monster I'd helped create by refusing to set boundaries, by never standing up for you, by always asking you to be the bigger person while never asking the same of them. I was crying now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of validation, of finally being seen and acknowledged after years of feeling invisible. Dad, I forgive you, I said, and I meant it completely. But I need you to understand that forgiveness doesn't mean things can just go back to the way they were. Trust has to be rebuilt. I know, he said, and I don't expect it to be easy or quick. I just need you to know that I'm done choosing anyone's comfort over your well-being, ever. David, who had been quietly listening to this exchange, finally spoke up. Mr. Jones, Elena and I have talked about this situation a lot over the past 2 years. We both understand that blended families are complicated, and we never expected you to choose sides. But we did expect you to protect Elena from being treated badly in her own father's house. Dad nodded. You're absolutely right, and I failed at that completely. So what happens now? I asked. With Sandra and the kids? Dad sighed deeply. I don't know yet. I meant what I said about packing some things and having a long conversation. Sandra and I need to figure out if there's any way to move forward after tonight. And honestly, I'm not optimistic. What about the twins and Melissa? David asked. They're adults, or close enough, Dad replied. Jake and Connor are 24 years old. They made their choices tonight as grown men, and they'll have to live with the consequences. As for Melissa, he paused, looking conflicted. She's still a teenager, and a lot of her behavior comes from watching her mother. But she's old enough to know that what she said to you tonight was cruel and unacceptable. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching our remaining friends dance and celebrate. The contrast between this peaceful moment and the chaos from earlier in the evening was striking. You know what the strangest part is? I said finally. I actually feel sorry for them. Both Dad and David looked at me in surprise. Think about it, I continued. They spent 5 years building their security on the idea that they could push me out and have Dad all to themselves. They manipulated and schemed and gradually isolated him from me, thinking they were winning some kind of game. But all they really did was show him who they truly are, and now they've lost everything they thought they were protecting. Dad considered this. Sandra always seemed to see love as a finite resource. Like, if I loved you, there was less love available for her and her children. She never understood that love multiplies, it doesn't divide. And now she's going to find out what it's like to actually compete for your attention, David observed, because she can't use Elena as a scapegoat anymore. That insight proved to be remarkably prescient. Over the next few weeks, as Dad tried to salvage his marriage, Sandra's true nature emerged completely. Without me as a common enemy to unite against, the cracks in their relationship became chasms. She tried to convince Dad that the wedding incident had been a misunderstanding, that emotions had run high and things had gotten out of hand. When that didn't work, she tried to blame her children, claiming she'd been pressured into confronting me by their complaints about being excluded from wedding planning. But Dad wasn't buying any of it anymore. The scales had fallen from his eyes, and he could see the patterns of manipulation and control that had defined their relationship from the beginning. Sandra hadn't just been threatened by me, she'd been threatened by any relationship Dad had that didn't center around her needs and wants. Meanwhile, the twins and Melissa were discovering that their comfortable life as Dad's favored stepchildren was over. Without me to blame for family tension, their own behavior came under scrutiny. Dad started noticing how they spoke to service workers, how they treated their friends, how they reacted when they didn't get their way. The academic competition that Melissa had supposedly attended, it turned out to be fictional. She'd actually spent the weekend at a friend's house because she didn't want to attend my wedding. When Dad discovered this lie, it was the final straw in his relationship with Sandra. But the most significant change was in Dad himself. It was like he'd been sleepwalking for 5 years and had suddenly woken up. He started reaching out to me regularly, not because he felt obligated to, but because he genuinely wanted to rebuild our relationship. 3 months after the wedding, he moved into a small apartment across town and filed for divorce from Sandra. The twins, being adults, moved out on their own. Melissa stayed with her mother, but the comfortable lifestyle they'd enjoyed as Dad's family was over. I feel like I got my father back, I told David one evening as we were cooking dinner in our new apartment, but I also feel guilty about breaking up their family.
You didn't break up anything, David replied firmly. You just refused to keep pretending that dysfunction was normal. There's a difference. He was right, of course. I hadn't destroyed Dad's marriage to Sandra. I'd simply stopped enabling it by absorbing all the dysfunction and conflict that kept it functioning. The wedding videos that our friends had taken became something of a phenomenon in our social circle, not because we shared them publicly, but because word spread about what had happened, and people were amazed by how clearly the footage showed the manipulation tactics that narcissistic families use. Rachel actually used the videos in a psychology class she was taking, with our permission, as an example of how family scapegoating works in real time. You can literally watch Elena being blamed for problems she didn't create by people who are actively creating those problems, her professor observed. Looking back now, 2 years later, I can see that my wedding day was actually a gift, even though it felt like a nightmare at the time. It was the day I stopped trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it to me authentically. It was the day Dad finally saw what his choices had cost both of us. And it was the day I learned that standing up for yourself, even when it's messy and public and painful, is always worth it in the end. The divorce proceedings revealed layers of Sandra's behavior that shocked even me, and I thought I'd seen the worst of it. Dad's lawyer discovered that Sandra had been systematically isolating him from his longtime friends, his extended family, and even his hobbies for years. She'd convinced him that his weekly poker games with college buddies were immature for a man his age, that his sister Jennifer was jealous of their happiness, and that his passion for woodworking was taking up too much space in the garage that her kids needed for their sports equipment. What I found most disturbing was learning about financial manipulation. Sandra had gradually taken over all the household finances under the guise of being more organized than Dad. She'd opened credit cards in his name to fund the twins' expensive college tuition and Melissa's private tutoring, while simultaneously convincing him that helping me with my student loans would be enabling dependency. Dad discovered this when his lawyer requested financial records for the divorce. Elena, she spent over $40,000 on Connor's senior year abroad program, he told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings. At the same time, she was telling me we couldn't afford to help with your wedding expenses because money was tight. The revelation that hit hardest was about my mother's jewelry. For years, I'd assumed Dad had put Mom's rings and necklaces in a safety deposit box for safekeeping. During the asset division process, I learned that Sandra had been wearing my mother's anniversary ring to social events. Not just wearing it, she'd had it resized to fit her finger. I don't know how I missed it, Dad said, his voice breaking. She told me she was wearing it to honor your mother's memory, and I was so grateful that she wasn't jealous of Rebecca that I didn't think about how you might feel about it. That betrayal cut deeper than anything Sandra had done directly to me. It wasn't just disrespect, it was a calculated erasure of my mother's presence in Dad's life. Sandra had literally taken my mother's place, down to wearing her jewelry. But the most unexpected development came from Melissa. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, she reached out to me through Facebook with a message that left me speechless. I know you probably hate me, and I deserve it, but I need to tell you something about what really happened before your wedding. My mom made us come to the reception. She said we were going to put Elena in her place once and for all, and that it was time Dad learned who his real family was. The twins didn't want to go either, but Mom said if we didn't show up as a united front, she'd make our lives miserable at home. I was scared of her, and I'm sorry I took it out on you. The message was 3 pages long, detailing how Sandra had orchestrated the entire wedding confrontation weeks in advance. She deliberately planned for them to miss the ceremony to maximize the impact of their arrival during my father-daughter dance. She'd coached them on what to say to make me look like the aggressor, and she'd promised them that Dad would choose his new family over me once he saw how selfish and ungrateful I really was.
She was wrong about everything, Melissa's message continued. Dad didn't choose us. He chose you, like he should have all along. And now Mom is angry all the time because her plan backfired, and she's taking it out on me. I'm living with my biological father now, and for the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe. I showed the message to David, who read it with growing amazement. This is like something out of a psychological thriller, he said. She actually planned the whole thing? Apparently so, I replied, still processing the information. And she got her kids to go along with it by making them afraid of the consequences if they didn't. The revelation reframed everything about that night. What I'd experienced as a spontaneous family meltdown had actually been a calculated attack designed to destroy my relationship with Dad permanently. The fact that it had backfired so spectacularly was almost poetic justice. I decided to respond to Melissa's message, not because I was ready to have a relationship with her, but because she deserved acknowledgement for having the courage to tell the truth. Thank you for reaching out, I wrote back. I'm glad you're in a safer situation now. What happened at my wedding was painful, but it also freed all of us from a toxic dynamic that wasn't healthy for anyone. I hope you can heal from whatever you experienced in that house. Melissa wrote back immediately. Can I ask you something? How did you stay so calm that night? If someone had ambushed me like that, I would have lost it completely. The question made me think about something I hadn't considered before. How had I stayed calm? Looking back, I realized it was because the confrontation had finally given me permission to tell the truth. For 5 years, I'd been biting my tongue, making excuses, trying to keep the peace. Having them attack me so publicly actually liberated me to respond honestly for the first time. I think I stayed calm because I was finally allowed to stop pretending, I wrote back. Your mom did me a favor by showing everyone who she really was. It meant I didn't have to keep protecting her image anymore. This exchange led to occasional messages between Melissa and me over the following months. Not a friendship exactly, but a civil relationship based on mutual understanding of what we'd both survived. She was seeing a therapist to work through years of living in Sandra's manipulative household, and she was slowly rebuilding her biological father. Mom always told us that your dad was trying to replace our real father, she confided in one message. But looking back, I think she was the one trying to erase our real father so she could have Marcus completely to herself. The twins, however, never reached out. According to Melissa, they'd doubled down on supporting their mother's version of events. They'd convinced themselves that Dad had been brainwashed by me and that our entire extended family was against them. Jake had even posted on social media about being abandoned by a father figure who chose his spoiled daughter over his stepchildren. They're living in Mom's alternate reality, Melissa explained, where she's the victim and everyone else is the villain. I think they need that story to feel okay about what they did. Dad was surprisingly philosophical about losing his relationship with the twins. They're adults, he said during one of our conversations. They made their choices with full knowledge of what they were doing. I can't force them to see the situation clearly, and I can't keep apologizing for finally standing up for my own daughter. The transformation in Dad over the past year has been remarkable to witness. He's reconnected with friends Sandra had driven away, started woodworking again, and even begun dating someone new, a widow named Patricia who lost her husband 3 years ago and has adult children of her own. The difference is incredible. I told David after meeting Patricia for the first time. She actually encourages Dad to talk about Mom, to maintain his relationships with me and his friends, to pursue his own interests. It's like watching him become himself again. Patricia's approach to being part of Dad's life was the complete opposite of Sandra's. Instead of trying to erase the past, she honored it. She asked to see photos of my mother, wanted to hear stories about our family traditions, and explicitly said she hoped to add to Dad's life rather than replace what he'd already built. "Your father talks about you constantly," she told me when we met. "I feel like I already know you from all the stories he's shared. He's so proud of how you handled that awful situation at your wedding." The contrast was startling. Where Sandra had seen my relationship with Dad as competition, Patricia saw it as evidence of his capacity for love and loyalty. But perhaps the most healing development has been the restoration of family traditions that Sandra had systematically eliminated. Last Christmas, Dad and I made Mom's famous sugar cookies together for the first time in 6 years. We hung her ornaments on his tree, and we talked about her openly and lovingly. "I forgot how much joy there was in our old traditions," Dad said as we were decorating. "Sandra convinced me that maintaining them meant I wasn't moving forward, but now I see that she just wanted to control the narrative of our family history." David and I also started our own tradition of hosting Sunday dinners, and Dad has become a regular attendee. Sometimes Patricia joins us, sometimes it's just the three of us. The atmosphere is relaxed and genuine in a way that family gatherings never were during the Sandra years. This is what normal feels like, I realized one Sunday as we were cleaning up after dinner. This is what family is supposed to feel like. The wedding videos have become something of a legend among our friends, but not in the way you might expect. They've become teaching tools, examples of how to recognize manipulation, how to set boundaries, and how to respond to narcissistic behavior with dignity and strength. Rachel recently told me that she'd shown portions of the video to her new boyfriend when she was explaining why she has such strong boundaries with toxic people. "Elena's wedding night is like a masterclass in refusing to be gaslit," she said. "You literally watched someone try to rewrite reality in real time and said, 'No, that's not what happened.'" Looking back now, almost 2 years later, I can honestly say that having my wedding crashed by my narcissistic stepfamily was one of the best things that ever happened to me. Not because the experience itself was positive, but because it forced a reckoning that was long overdue. I got my father back, I learned to trust my own perceptions, I discovered that standing up for yourself, even when it's messy and public, is always worth it. And most importantly, I learned that you can't love people for treating you well, but you can refuse to accept poor treatment, even from people you love. Sandra's grand plan to destroy my relationship with Dad and secure her position as his primary family had exactly the opposite effect. She destroyed her own position by revealing her true nature, and she gave me the gift of finally being seen and protected by my father. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to a dysfunctional family system is for someone to refuse to play their assigned role anymore. That's exactly what I did at my wedding reception, and it set all of us free. 2.5 years after my wedding, Sandra made one final attempt to destroy what Dad and I had rebuilt. It came in the form of a lawsuit that was so outrageous, so calculated, and so vindictive that it actually strengthened my resolve rather than breaking it. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning while David and I were having breakfast. A process server knocked on our door and handed me an envelope that would have been laughable if it hadn't been so malicious. Sandra was suing me for intentional infliction of emotional distress and defamation of character, claiming that my behavior at my own wedding had caused her psychological damage and damaged her reputation in the community. According to the lawsuit, I had deliberately orchestrated a public humiliation of Sandra and her children, manipulated witnesses to record false evidence against them, and conspired with wedding guests to make them appear to be the aggressors. She was seeking $50,000 in damages plus legal fees.
David read the papers over my shoulder, his coffee growing cold as his anger built. "This is insane," he said. "She's literally suing you for defending yourself at your own wedding."
But what made the lawsuit truly bizarre was Sandra's version of events as described in the legal documents. According to her filing, she and her children had arrived at the reception as invited guests, only to be ambushed and verbally attacked by me in front of shocked wedding attendees. She claimed that I had screamed obscenities at them, completely false, that David had physically threatened her minor daughter. Melissa was 17 at the time, but David had never even spoken to her, and that my father had been coerced into taking my side against his will. The most audacious claim was that the wedding guests had been coached in advance to record the confrontation to make Sandra's family look bad, as if I had somehow known they would show up uninvited and had prepared an elaborate conspiracy to frame them. She's living in a completely alternate reality, I told my lawyer, Jennifer Walsh, when we met to discuss the case. None of this even remotely resembles what actually happened. Jennifer, a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in family law, looked over the filing with growing amazement. In 20 years of practice, I've never seen anything quite like this. She's essentially suing you for the consequences of her own actions. What Sandra hadn't counted on was that we had extensive video evidence of the entire confrontation taken by multiple guests from different angles. When Jennifer reviewed the footage, she actually laughed out loud. "This is the best evidence I've ever seen in a case like this," she said. "Not only does it completely contradict every claim in her lawsuit, but it actually shows her doing exactly what she's accusing you of doing. She's the one who showed up uninvited, she's the one who started the confrontation, and she's the one whose behavior was completely inappropriate." The lawsuit had an unexpected side effect. It brought our entire extended family and friend group together in a way I hadn't anticipated. When word spread about Sandra's legal action, people who had witnessed the wedding confrontation began reaching out to offer their testimony and support. Tommy, David's cousin, who had photographed the wedding, volunteered to provide his professional footage free of charge. "That woman is completely delusional if she thinks she can rewrite history when I have HD video of the whole thing," he said. My Aunt Margaret, now 82 years old, was so incensed by the lawsuit that she insisted on giving a deposition. "That young man called me an old lady in a disrespectful manner," she told Jennifer with steel in her voice. "I've been around long enough to recognize a bully when I see one, and I'm not going to let them rewrite what happened." Even more surprising was the response from people I barely knew. The DJ from our wedding, Marcus Williams, reached out through our venue coordinator to offer his testimony. "I've been working weddings for 15 years, he said. I've never seen anything like what that family did to your reception. If they want to lie about it in court, I'll gladly set the record straight." The most powerful testimony came from Patricia, Dad's new partner. She hadn't been at the wedding, but she'd heard about it from Dad and had witnessed Sandra's continued harassment of him during the divorce proceedings. "Sandra called Marcus repeatedly during our first few months of dating," Patricia told Jennifer during her deposition. "She would claim there were emergencies with the children or financial issues that needed immediate attention or problems with the house. It became clear that she was trying to sabotage his new relationship by creating constant drama that required his attention." Patricia also revealed something that shocked me. Sandra had actually confronted her in a grocery store 6 months earlier, warning her to stay away from Elena's influence because I was a manipulative person who destroys families. She told me that Elena had turned Marcus against his stepchildren out of jealousy, Patricia said. But having gotten to know Elena over the past year, I can see that the opposite is true. Sandra was the one who was jealous, and she projected that onto Elena. As we prepared for trial, more details emerged about Sandra's behavior since the divorce. She'd been telling anyone who would listen that Dad had abandoned his stepchildren for his spoiled daughter, and that I had somehow brainwashed him into choosing me over them. The twins had apparently bought into this narrative completely. According to Melissa, who was now living full-time with her biological father, Jake and Connor had convinced themselves that Dad had been a loving stepfather until I poisoned him against them. They've created this whole mythology where they were perfect stepchildren, and Elena was this evil manipulator, Melissa explained in a phone call. Mom has encouraged this because it makes her feel better about what happened. But the most disturbing revelation came from Dad's financial records during the discovery phase of the lawsuit. Our lawyer uncovered evidence that Sandra had been planning some kind of confrontation for months before the wedding. She'd made several large purchases in the weeks leading up to the event: new clothes for herself and her children, expensive shoes, even professional hair and makeup appointments scheduled for the day of the wedding. People don't spend hundreds of dollars on their appearance for an event they're supposedly too sick to attend, Jennifer pointed out. This evidence supports the theory that she planned the whole confrontation in advance. The smoking gun came from Sandra's phone records. On the morning of the wedding, she'd made over 30 text messages and phone calls to her children, coordinating their arrival at the reception. The timestamps showed that they'd been in constant communication throughout the day, planning exactly when and how to make their entrance. "Your Honor," Jennifer said during pretrial motions, "the plaintiff is essentially asking this court to award her damages for the failure of her own premeditated plan to publicly humiliate the defendant at her wedding. The evidence clearly shows that Miss Henderson orchestrated this confrontation with the intention of forcing Mr. Jones to choose between his daughter and his stepfamily in the most public and hurtful way possible." Sandra's lawyer, a tired-looking man who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with his client's case, tried to argue that the phone records and purchases could be explained by normal wedding preparation activities. But when Jennifer played the wedding videos in court, even he seemed to realize how untenable Sandra's position was. The footage was devastating to Sandra's claims. You could clearly see her arriving with her children, looking perfectly healthy and beautifully dressed. You could hear her initiating the confrontation, see her children being disrespectful and aggressive, and watch the entire family's behavior escalate from inappropriate to inexcusable. When Sandra took the stand to testify on her own behalf, the cross-examination was brutal. Jennifer systematically went through each claim in the lawsuit and showed how the video evidence contradicted it. "Miss Henderson, you testified that you arrived at the reception as an invited guest. Can you explain why you told Mr. Jones earlier that day that you were too ill to attend?" "I was feeling better by evening," Sandra replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "You testified that Elena screamed obscenities at you. Can you point to any place in this video where she uses profanity?" "Well, her tone was very aggressive," Sandra said weakly. "Miss Henderson, you claim that Elena manipulated the wedding guests to record false evidence against you. Are you suggesting that multiple people with no connection to Elena conspired to frame you?" By the end of her testimony, Sandra's credibility was completely destroyed. The judge, an experienced family court jurist named Judge Patricia Morrison, looked increasingly skeptical as Sandra's lawyer tried to maintain his client's version of events. The trial lasted 3 days, and the verdict was swift and decisive. Not only did Judge Morrison dismiss Sandra's lawsuit entirely, but she also ordered Sandra to pay our legal fees and court costs. In her written decision, the judge included language that was unusually harsh for a civil ruling. The plaintiff's claims are not only without merit, but appear to be a continuation of the same manipulative and vindictive behavior that was documented at the defendant's wedding reception, Judge Morrison wrote. "The evidence clearly shows that the plaintiff orchestrated a public confrontation with the intention of humiliating the defendant, and when that plan backfired, she has now attempted to use the court system to continue her harassment." The judge also issued a restraining order preventing Sandra from contacting me, David, or Dad for any reason not related to legitimate legal matters concerning their divorce settlement. When we walked out of the courthouse, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. Sandra's lawsuit had been her final card to play, her last attempt to punish me for refusing to accept her treatment. And not only had it failed, but it had actually validated everything I'd experienced and created a legal record of her behavior. "She really thought she could rewrite history," David said as we drove home. Even with video evidence, she genuinely believed she could convince a judge that you were the aggressor. Dad, who had testified on my behalf during the trial, was quiet for most of the drive home. Finally, he spoke up from the back seat. "I keep thinking about all the times Sandra convinced me that you were being too sensitive or dramatic about her behavior," he said. "Watching her lie under oath about what happened at your wedding, I can see how she probably lied to me about smaller things for years. I just never caught her in anything this obvious before." The lawsuit's failure marked the end of Sandra's ability to influence our lives in any meaningful way. With the restraining order in place and her credibility completely destroyed, she finally had to accept that her plan to replace me in Dad's life had not only failed, but had cost her everything she'd tried to protect. A year later, I learned through Melissa that Sandra had moved to Arizona to live with her sister, leaving behind the house she'd shared with Dad and the community where her reputation had been ruined by the lawsuit. The twins had graduated college and moved to different cities, still maintaining their version of events, but no longer having any platform to spread it. "Mom still talks about the lawsuit sometimes," Melissa told me during one of our occasional check-ins. "She's convinced that the judge was biased and that you somehow manipulated the legal system too. She can't accept that she lost because she was wrong." But for me, the lawsuit had been a gift. It had forced me to relive the wedding confrontation in detail, but this time with the support of the entire legal system. It had shown me how strong I'd become, and it had proven beyond any doubt that my perception of Sandra's behavior had been accurate all along. Most importantly, it demonstrated that standing up to manipulative people, even when they escalate their attacks, is always the right choice. Sandra's lawsuit was her attempt to punish me for refusing to be her victim, but instead, it became the final proof that I was never the problem in our family dynamic. She'd wanted to destroy me legally and financially, but instead, she'd given me the ultimate validation. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.